cultural center of the Caucasus Yazidis presents to your attention the fifth part of the topic of the rights of Yazidis to their native language and education. Many Yazidis, Yazidi organizations and international organizations perceive the absence of preschool institutions in the Yazidi language as assimilation. Their absence means that children enter schools with a non-native language sector, studying without initial training. Many experts, legal experts, human rights activists consider this a restriction on the right to education, and this restriction makes itself felt in the further progress of students. During their studies they always face difficulties in getting an education. Naturally, in places of dispersed residence of Yazidis, parents begin to think about sending their children to kindergartens in the language of the titular nation, and subsequently to schools with a non-native language sector. All this is so interconnected and intertwined, but in the end, it boils down to one thing: the actual disappearance of the right and opportunity of Yazidis to receive education in their native language. It is important to note that we are talking about the existence of an international and constitutional right to the opportunity to receive education in their native language. When this right to opportunity disappears, it is already discrimination in the direction of the entire Yazidi society towards assimilation. Today's children and entire generations, for the most part, do not know how to read or write in their native language, and they prefer not to speak in Yazidi language. They were deprived of the opportunity to receive education in their native language. If you look closely at Yazidis today, they have features of blurring ethnic identity. There are features of assimilation. Naturally, Yazidi community, the socially active part of Yazidis, have a fear that the same method of education will be maintained in secondary schools in all countries of residence and in the future. The study of the history and geography of Yazidis is not taught either in their native language or in the state language. Part 6. Today, the children of the Yazidi society in the countries of residence cannot get acquainted with the national history, culture and religion of the Yazidi people. As noted, and stated, already as inevitable, the overwhelming majority of activists from among Yazidis, public organizations, today the Yazidi community is facing the threat that in the next 20 years Yazidis will lose their identity. On the part of the educational structures of the countries of residence, the Yazidi community sees no interest in resolving the above problems. It becomes obvious that the state is not interested in creating conditions for the formation of the Yazidi community in their native language. This situation contradicts international obligations and the UN Charter. The Yazidi people should have the legislative right to seek ways and means to create their own institutions of higher education. It is also important to take into account the experience in the recent past, when there were Yazidi educational institutions in the country's general education system and managed them. This fact should be taken into account when determining future modules of provision. Due to the importance that international documents attach to intercultural education, the coverage of the history, culture and traditions of minorities, state educational institutions still do not fulfill their obligations to guarantee the inclusion of teaching the full history of Yazidi people, Yazidi culture and traditions in the general compulsory curricula. The right of the Yazidi community to develop and enjoy its culture. Part 7. The cultural rights of Yazidi people in the countries of residence imposes an obligation on the UN member states, namely the obligation to respect, protect and exercise these cultural rights. The obligation to respect rights requires the state to refrain from interfering in the enjoyment and additional and intensive encouragement in the enjoyment of cultural rights. The obligation to exercise rights requires states to take appropriate legislative, administrative, budgetary and other measures for the full realization of cultural rights. The situation regarding the rights to use and develop culture together with other members of the Yazidi community largely reflects the general situation with human rights and freedoms. Today, no attention is paid to the cultural rights of the Yazidi community. Accessibility and exercise of cultural rights of national minorities. Access to culture gives society the basis for democratization and the establishment of a rule of law. In this regard, we can talk about the reverse course. It is with developed cultural rights and access to culture by ethnic minorities, in our case, the Yazidis, that the legal awareness of the population and the possibility of creating a rule of law state can be guaranteed. Considering the situation regarding the cultural rights of Yazidi society in the countries of residence, we can see an almost identical situation. The right to culture of the Yazidi community is gradually dissolving and disappearing, which contradicts all international norms. Most states have legislated for the right of national minorities to enjoy cultural rights, including for Yazidi society. But Yazidi society does not have a really working mechanism for protection and preservation, access to culture. The feeling of proactive connivance on the part of the state and the lack of political will does not justify the current situation and the situation of Yazidi society. The real possibilities that Yazidi community has created conditions for access, development, preservation of features, traditions and culture are close to a minimum. In the future, to zero. Yazidis in many countries of residence still do not have working cultural centers, Sunday schools funded by the state of residence. Yazidi society is deprived of its theater. There is no encouragement and support for Yazidi cultural scientists, artists or other artists. In general, it can be described as follows: Yazidi people are not given the opportunity to organize and develop their cultural life.